Thanks for inviting me to the John Jay Anthropology Department's conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person due to the storm, but thanks to what Marx called the annihilation of space by time, hopefully I'll still be able to contribute something to your conversation on political ecology. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes being a complete hypocrite. This talk is about parks, and as you might have guessed, I'm going to be critical of them. But the truth is, I love parks, and in fact I was born and raised in one of the most magnificent parks on the planet, the one I'm going to talk about today. And who can argue with parks anyway? They're green, they're beautiful, and they're some of the few remaining places on our planet that haven't been privatized to death. Parks are quintessential public spaces, so why criticize them? On the face of it, parks would seem to constitute a bulwark against capitalism's tendency toward what geographer David Harvey has called accumulation by dispossession. So if anything, we should be defending them. But capitalism is exactly the rub. Parks are somewhat older than the capitalist mode of production, but they take on a very specific meaning and function under the auspices of this system, and that's the gist of the critique I'm going to make today. My argument isn't for the abolition of one park or another, or even necessarily against the idea of parks altogether. Rather, it's that we need to understand how something that seems to stand for environmental justice in the face of mass dispossession often works out in precisely the opposite way, and what conditions might plausibly make it otherwise. So the park I'm going to talk about today is called the Adirondack Park, and if you're a New Yorker, this park belongs to you. Chances are you've never heard of it, though if you vote in New York state elections, you've probably helped to make some decisions about what happens to it, for any proposed alteration on the public lands of the park is subject to a statewide vote. The first thing to understand about the Adirondack Park is that it's massive, at least by American standards. The park's border is called the Blue Line because when it was created in 1892 by the state of New York, its boundary was drawn on the map in blue ink. The Blue Line contains 6 million acres of wilderness, so the park as a whole contains about a fifth of New York State's landmass. Only 2 of our national parks are larger than it, and it would neatly fit Yosemite, Yellowstone, Glacier, Grand Canyon, and Great Smokies National Parks inside of it. But the Adirondack Park is fundamentally different from our national park model, insofar as it comprises a mix of public and private lands. This is another characteristic that makes the Adirondack Park unusual. People are born in this park, and some indeed live out their lives here from cradle to grave. The ratio of public to private land has grown over time. The slide you're looking at now shows the original Blue Line in 1892, when the park was significantly smaller. The dark green bits show the original public lands of the park, collectively called the Forest Preserve, which were far sparser in the late 19th century. In 1971, the Blue Line was dramatically expanded, and in the interim, the state of New York acquired significantly more land for the Forest Preserve, which now includes both the dark and light green part of this map. Altogether, the park today is about half private and half public lands. The Forest Preserve itself is protected by the New York State Constitution, which is why it's so difficult to change. The amendment that created the Forest Preserve was later used as the blueprint for the National Wilderness Act and is often called the Forever Wild Clause. It is one of the most stringent and ironclad environmental preservation laws in the world, and it has teeth. Many have tried to challenge this law in the park's 125-year-old history, and almost no one has won. It really is the land of mustn't touch. Something else happened in 1971 when the park was enlarged, which has also helped to make the Adirondack Park an unusual eco-social experiment. Up until this point in time, the private lands of the park were not subject to much more regulation than any other land in the United States. But in 1971, the state of New York changed that, creating something called the Adirondack Park Agency to regulate all private property inside the Blue Line. As you might imagine, the local population, in alliance with powerful outside developers, opposed this move in the strongest possible terms, but the APA Act was passed anyway, and today every square inch of land inside the Blue Line is subject to stringent environmental regulation. I won't go into all the details of the so-called master plan which governs the park, but in essence, Adirondack private property is regulated by a zoning system based mainly on the principle of density. The system is designed to channel private development towards some areas of the park and away from others, allowing a limited number of buildings per square mile in each of the private zones. In essence, this is an anti-urbanization plan intended to preserve the extreme rural and wilderness character of most of the park and allowing unbridled development in only a very few spots. For the most part, if you want to stick a shovel in the dirt and build something on private property inside the blue line, you will likely have to obtain a permit for it. If you don't, and you violate APA law, the state can make you tear it down. The map you are looking at now shows all of the park's various zones, both public and private, so as you can see, it's a pretty complicated system. Before we move on to a critique of this model, I'd like to point out one other important thing about the Adirondack Park, which has to do with its location. The park contains some of the most rural communities east of the Mississippi River. My county, which is the one marked Hamilton on this map and circled in red, has about 4,700 year-round residents. The park is made up of 12 counties altogether, but only 2, Hamilton and Essex, are located entirely inside the blue line. The other 10 are divided by it. Hamilton County is the most rural community in New York State, with about 3 people per square mile. To be fair, that's pretty crowded for us. Our population topped out in the 1990s at over 5,000 residents, but for most of our history we've had far fewer than this. Since this heady decade, our population has been declining. Our 9 towns currently range from 86 residents to about 1,300, and these figures are from 2010, so the population is probably smaller today. Morehouse, the one marked 86 people down in the southwestern corner, really has only about 60-some. Even within the blue line, we're pretty unusual. Our sister county of Essex, with which you may be familiar because it's the location of Lake Placid, which has twice hosted the Winter Olympics, has 35,000 people by comparison. So Hamilton County really is the back of beyond. We have 4 major roads, no hospital, nothing even approaching a city, and we have never, in all of our 200-year history, had a permanent stoplight. In fact, we don't really have much by way of light at all. If you look at the Adirondack Park from space, it looks like a big black hole in upstate New York, which is pretty much what it is. All of this is opposed to the place where you're sitting right now, Manhattan, which has about 75,000 people per square mile. Yet these two extremes are only a few hours apart. In fact, the Adirondack Park stands within a day's drive of about 80 million people between the United States and Canada, and that's another thing that makes it so unique. You'll find even more rural communities in the United States, particularly out west and in Alaska. But very few such communities stand in such close proximity to such an intensely urbanized area, and that extreme uneven development has had a profound effect upon the history of the park. So now you've seen what the Adirondack Park looks like on a map, you're probably wondering what it looks like on the ground. In short, by today's aesthetic standards, it's a stunning landscape. The park is covered with low mountains rising to a maximum of about 5,000 feet, and almost entirely covered with mixed deciduous and boreal forest. It's also covered with water, with over 3,000 lakes and hundreds of miles of rivers and streams. As you can see from these artsy shots I pulled randomly off the web, it's a favorite with photographers, as it was a favorite for painters including the Hudson River School decades ago. But truth be told, it's very difficult to take a bad picture of this place. Due to the strict environmental regulation of the park and its preponderance of forest preserve, most of the park looks like these shots of largely undeveloped wilderness, punctuated by a few towns, villages, and hamlets. This last shot is of Saranac Lake, one of our larger villages. This is about as developed as development gets in the Adirondacks. So by now you're probably wondering, what's the problem? How on earth could anyone argue with that? The Adirondack Park seems an ideal compromise between preservation and occupation. The landscape is protected, but not entirely closed off. Anyone crazy enough to want to live without hospitals and stoplights and Starbucks can move there and live year-round if they please, and the rest of us get to visit for free. You wouldn't be alone in thinking this way. The Adirondack Park is lauded by the environmental community as one of the most successful eco-social experiments in history. It has even been recognized by UNESCO, and together with the adjoining Champlain Valley, forms the largest biosphere reserve in the United States and the fourth largest in the world. Yet the superlative praise which covers the Adirondack Park masks a long history of displacement. The park, like most parks, is essentially an exercise in enclosure, a term with which you are probably more familiar in terms of English history and the Industrial Revolution. The English enclosure movement, which witnessed the privatization and consolidation of common-use land in the English countryside between the 16th and the 19th centuries, is a quintessential example of accumulation by dispossession. It helped to drive both urbanization and industrialization in England, driving peasants from the countryside to the city, and punishing all who dared resist it. The history of the Adirondack region is also a history of enclosure, and the formation and regulation of the Adirondack Park is only a part of this long story. The first peoples to be displaced from the Adirondacks were indigenous. Archaeological evidence indicates that for some 10,000 years before the arrival of European conquerors, indigenous groups including the Haudenosaunee, more commonly known by their exonym the Iroquois, along with some Algonquian-speaking groups, laid claim to Adirondack territory. They did not, however, settle here year-round. That's because indigenous people were not stupid. The Haudenosaunee in particular built a vast and complex civilization from farming the rich river valleys of what would later become New York State, and knew better than to practice agriculture in the tough, rocky, root-ridden, and acidic soils of the Adirondacks. They did, however, use the region as a space for supplemental foraging, exchange, and as a travel corridor. Europeans first arrived in the Adirondack region in 1609, when Samuel de Champlain sailed into the vast lake on our southeastern border that he would modestly name after himself. But white colonists didn't really begin to settle the Adirondack region until around the time of the American Revolution, and it was this event that triggered the first wave of Adirondack enclosure and displacement. In the wake of the Revolutionary War, New York, along with every other state in the newly formed Union, was broke. The colonies had thrown every resource they had at the struggle with the British, and were eager in the wake of their win to refill their coffers. What New York called the extinguishment of Indian lands, including the Adirondacks, was key to this process. Adirondack land that had previously belonged to the Crown now reverted to ownership of the state of New York. Much of the rest of the region the state bought, stole, or otherwise acquired, generally by abusive and duplicitous means, from the Mohawk and the Oneida. It then proceeded to patent this land out to any white settlers who would take it. The point was to privatize the mountains and encourage development, upon which the state could then levy taxes. Maps which previously marked the Adirondacks as Iroquoian territory began to drop such labels, as the indigenous people of the Adirondacks were dispossessed of their ancient territories. Still, permanent development proceeded slowly in the wake of the Revolution. Those homesteaders who did take on the challenge found the Adirondack climate extremely inhospitable to human habitation. Nonetheless, the first year-round colonists of the Adirondacks developed a livelihood based on a combination of mountain agriculture and foraging. While little material evidence from this epoch of Adirondack history remains, the poor quality of the region's infrastructure, as well as its distance from urban markets, suggests that this was truly a period of subsistence, in which poor white homesteaders grew, caught, trapped, shot, gathered, and otherwise obtained their necessities themselves. This period of subsistence would last until roughly the mid-19th century, when market forces crashed into the Adirondack Mountains with the force of a tsunami. They came in two forms almost simultaneously: extraction and tourism. Outsiders came to the Adirondacks at this time for one of two reasons. The first was to exploit the region's natural resources, especially the lumber and minerals voraciously devoured by a rapidly urbanizing northeastern United States. Many Adirondack homesteaders found work in these industries, and further labor was supplied by capital itself, which recruited migrant labor from distant cities who swelled the tiny population of the Adirondacks on a seasonal basis, then disappeared as fast as they had arrived. The second was to escape the consequences of this urbanization. Urban Americans of means increasingly found the cities they had built to be deeply unpleasant, and as the United States developed, sought out respite in the deep, peaceful forests of the Adirondacks, where they built great camps like the one depicted here in Hamilton County's Racket Lake. Racket was indeed developed by some of the magnates of American industry, from J.P. Morgan to Alfred Vanderbilt. Such men hired Adirondack locals as guides to lead them through the vagaries of the dangerous backwoods to trophies of fish and game. The exploitation of the Adirondack landscape by American capital, whether for purposes of wilderness extraction or wilderness consumption, triggered the second wave of Adirondack displacement. The poor homesteaders who had first settled the Adirondacks, many of whom became guides and lumbermen as the cash economy exploded, increasingly found themselves caught between the vast forces vying for control of the landscape. The subsistence economy that had sustained them for over a century slowly faded. Previously common lands were increasingly privatized, and development itself decimated the landscape upon which such homesteaders relied for survival. The third wave of enclosure-induced displacement came courtesy of the state itself, and this is where the park comes into our story. For much of post-revolutionary Adirondack history, New York State encouraged the exploitation of the landscape, even designated its rivers highways for the transport of logs from the forest. Scientific discoveries toward the end of the 19th century changed all that. Advances in scientific silviculture divulged that the destruction of forests meant the destruction of watershed, and the Adirondack Park was the watershed for two key transportational routes in the 19th century, the Hudson River and the Erie Canal. The rampant destruction of the Adirondack forest threatened both of these waterways, and also threatened to hand a monopoly on capitalistic circulation to the burgeoning downstate railroads. In the face of desertification, the state of New York stepped in, creating first the Forest Preserve and then the Adirondack Park to enclose it. Eviction ensued, as many locals previously regarded as noble guides and homesteaders were displaced from Forest Preserve lands. Further changes were in store for the Adirondacks in the 20th century, which would eventually trigger the fourth and current wave of Adirondack displacement. From roughly the 1930s onward, the resource extraction industry faded, while the tourist industry survived, though in a much changed form. Toward the end of this century, gentrification overtook the Adirondacks as the era of the great camps passed, and improved transportation opened the region to a more modest cohort of middle-class tourists, many of whom began to build seasonal homes from modest cabins to multi-million-dollar compounds, especially on our lake shores. In the last few decades, the number of seasonal homes in Hamilton County has far outstripped the number of permanent ones, with seasonal housing comprising as much as 80% of the housing stock in some towns. At the same time, the state has added lands to the Forest Preserve, which in some Hamilton County towns now comprises 90% of all land. Year-round locals, in the main a cohort of working-class families dependent upon the precarious local tourist trade and its low wages, have been squeezed out spatially as well as economically. Year-round rental housing is particularly in short supply, a factor which has helped to drive out Adirondack working-class youth, the one age cohort which reliably depends upon rental housing rather than home ownership. As a result, the Adirondack population is not only shrinking, but aging, with our median age now far above that of state and national levels. The million-dollar question is, to what extent has this predicament resulted from the presence of the park? Given that many of the same demographic changes are happening across other parts of rural America, might this condition have manifested anyway, even without the park? Recent evidence suggests that the park does make a difference, and studies of wilderness preserves in other areas of the U.S. support these findings. In essence, private land near state-owned wilderness sells at substantially higher prices than other types of land. Real estate brokers have recognized this phenomenon for years, and real estate advertisements have for several decades borne the claim "borders state land," an accolade ensuring that the investor will never have to confront wilderness development on his or her own borders. In essence, the forest preserve acts as a rent sink, something akin to a black hole. Since the forest preserve essentially removes land forever from capitalistic production and circulation, the only rent to be gleaned from it is the tax paid to local municipalities by the state. But that rent dead ends there. It cannot be reinvested in the forest preserve itself in the generation of further rent, for the forest preserve cannot, by law, be developed beyond the minor cutting of primitive trails and the stocking of fish. Yet much like a black hole, something strange happens near the event horizon of the forest preserve. Nearby private land prices are supercharged, contributing to gentrification and increasing the cost of wilderness living for the local working class. None of this would work the way it does without uneven development. Parks are a manifestation of our tendency under capitalism to make some landscapes sacred because so many others are rendered profane. Preservation only really makes sense in dialectical opposition to its foil, exploitation. If the Adirondack region continues to decline, the lessons for environmentalism are sobering. If, in the long run, the Adirondack experiment fails, demonstrating that the only way to keep nature safe is to keep humans away from it, that doesn't bode well for the rest of the planet. I would contend that the next logical step in a truly radical environmental movement is not to build more parks, but to build a world that doesn't require them in the first place. A world in which all landscapes, and the people that produce and live on them, are considered sacred rather than disposable.